You know, when you reach my age, people assume you've seen everything. They pat your hand, offer a polite smile, and decide that the stories you tell are nothing more than the ramblings of an old woman whose mind tends to wander. But let me tell you something, darling. The things I've seen, the things I've survived, the things I've lived through are as real as the cold that seeps into these old bones every winter. Some memories don't fade with time. They sharpen, they wait. And on nights like this, when the snow falls thick and the wind moans against the windows, they return to me as clearly as the day they happened. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 4 stories. 4 winter tales that changed me. 4 nights I should never have survived. And before you dismiss them as the fantasies of a senile grandmother, remember this. I'm still here. I'm still breathing. But not everyone in these stories can say the same. So pull your blanket a little tighter. Make sure the door is locked, because once I begin, you'll wish you'd never asked about my past. Before we begin, make sure you're prepared. And if this old story is already unsettling you, tap the like button so I know you're listening. It was December of 1967, and I was 23 years old, young, foolish, and utterly convinced of my own invincibility. I had just landed my first teaching job at a tiny elementary school in northern Maine. So small, it didn't even appear on most maps. The locals called the place the Ridge because it sat on a plateau surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The school was a 40-minute drive from my apartment, and the road between them was nothing more than a narrow strip of asphalt that wound like a snake through that dark forest. No street lights, no gas stations, no houses, just trees, snow, and the occasional deer that would leap across the road and nearly stop your heart. When I finally left the school that Friday night, it was around 9 p.m. I'd stayed late grading exam papers. Those were the days when I was desperate to prove myself, and staying late was something I did far too often. Snow had been falling steadily all evening, and by the time I locked up the building and headed toward my car, there were a good 6 inches on the ground. The wind was fierce, cutting through my wool coat as if it were made of paper. I should have stayed at the school. I should have slept on the teacher's lounge couch and waited for morning. But I was young and stubborn, and I wanted to go home, to my own warm bed. So I scraped the ice from my windshield, started the engine, and set out onto that lonely road. The first 20 minutes were fine. The snow was heavy, but my headlights cut through it well enough, and I knew the road by heart. I kept the radio on, some crackling station playing Christmas carols, and I sang along to keep myself company. The wipers worked overtime, pushing the snow aside in rhythmic sweeps that were almost hypnotic. That's when I saw her. If you're still listening, tell me, darling, what would you do if you saw someone standing there in the snow? At first, I thought it was a deer, a pale shape standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. But as I got closer, slamming on the brakes and feeling my car slide slightly on the icy pavement, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a thin white nightgown, the kind you'd wear to bed on a warm summer night. No coat, no shoes. Her long dark hair hung wet and limp against her face, and her skin, God, her skin was so pale it was almost blue. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging at her sides, staring directly at my car with eyes that didn't blink. I sat there, engine idling, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The temperature outside was well below freezing. Nobody could survive out here dressed like that. Nobody. But there she was. I rolled down my window just a crack, cold air rushing in and stealing my breath. "Ma'am," I called out, "are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, swaying slightly in the wind like a tree. That's when I noticed her feet, or rather, where her feet should have been. The snow around her was undisturbed, perfectly smooth. There were no footprints leading to where she stood, none at all. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, every instinct in my body screaming at me to drive, to put my foot on the gas and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. Something kept me frozen in place, staring at this impossible woman in the middle of the road. Then she moved. It wasn't a natural movement. She didn't walk or step. She glided forward, her body rigid, her feet never touching the ground. She moved toward my car, slowly, deliberately, and with every inch she covered, the temperature inside my vehicle seemed to drop. My breath came out in thick clouds. Frost began to crawl across the inside of my windshield, spreading like veins. I reached for the gear shift, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. But before I could put the car into reverse, she was at my window, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine. They were empty, completely stripped of life, warmth, humanity. She opened her mouth, and instead of words, a sound came out. A low, guttural moan that I can still hear even today, vibrating in the car, in my bones, in my soul. I screamed. I finally found the gear shift and slammed the car into reverse, my tires spinning wildly on the ice. Her hand, if you could even call it a hand, hit the window, leaving a wet, frozen smear of an impossibly long, impossibly thin handprint. I could smell something burning, like hot metal on ice. For what felt like an eternity, I backed away, never taking my eyes off her. She just stood there, watching me, her mouth still open in that awful, silent scream. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. The road was empty. The snow was falling untouched, as if she had never been there at all. But I knew. The handprint on my window remained, a perfect frosted imprint of fingers far too long, far too thin, far too wrong. I drove home in a daze, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for 10 minutes. I was shaking so hard from terror that I couldn't bring myself to get out, terrified she'd be waiting for me in the dark. The next morning, I went back to that stretch of road. In the daylight, it looked normal. Just trees and snow and asphalt. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen her, I stopped the car and got out. There, in the snow on the side of the road, half buried and nearly invisible, was a small wooden cross, the kind people put up to mark where someone died in an accident. I knelt down and brushed the snow away. The name was faded, barely legible, but I could make it out. Eleanor Finch, 1899 to 1923, frozen in the storm. She'd been dead for 44 years. I never drove that road alone at night again. And to this day, whenever I see a woman standing on the side of the road in winter, I don't stop. I don't slow down. I keep driving. Because some things, once they're dead, should stay that way. But they don't always. You're still here. Good. That means you're braver than most, or perhaps more foolish. Either way, you've earned the second story. This one happened 15 years after The Frozen Woman, in the winter of 1982. I was 38 by then, married, with 2 children of my own. We'd moved to a bigger town, bought a house with a yard, the whole American dream. My husband worked at the lumber mill, and I'd taken a job at the local library to help make ends meet. That December, the cold was brutal. The kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe, that freezes the inside of your nose the moment you step outside. The town had been battered by storm after storm, and by the week before Christmas, there was more than a meter of snow on the ground. Schools were closed. The roads were nearly impassable. Most people stayed home, gathered around their fireplaces, waiting for the weather to break. But the library was open. It always stayed open, even in the worst weather, because aside from the church, it was the only warm place in town, and Mrs. Henderson, who ran it, believed books were more important than any snowstorm. I admired that idealistic streak in her, even if it meant I had to wade through snow up to my waist just to get there every morning. It was Tuesday evening, around 6 p.m., and I was the only one working. Mrs. Henderson had left early because her husband was ill, and she'd asked me to close the library. The building was empty. It had been empty all day, and I was just finishing the last of the shelving when I heard the news. Singing. If that sent a little chill down your spine, let me know in the comments, darling. I need to know I'm not the only one hearing it. Children's voices, high and sweet, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Who in their right mind would have children outside in this weather, especially this late? But the singing continued, growing louder, closer, and I set down the books I was holding and walked to the front window. The street outside was dark, the street lights barely cutting through the swirling snow. But there, in the middle of the road, I could see them. 5 children, maybe 6 or 7 years old, holding hands in a circle. They were singing a Christmas carol, Silent Night. But there was something wrong with it. The melody was too slow, too deliberate, and their voices had a hollow quality, like they were singing from inside a tunnel. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in photographs from the 1800s. Long coats, wool scarves, leather boots, and they were perfectly still, their mouths moving in unison, their heads tilted at identical angles. It was like watching a music box, mechanical and wrong. I pressed my face closer to the glass, my breath fogging it up. That's when I realized they had no shadows. The streetlight was directly above them, and there should have been shadows. But there was nothing. Just those children, suspended in the snow, singing their eerie song. My hand reached for the phone. I should call someone, I thought. The police, my husband, anyone. But before I could move, one of the children, a little girl with blonde hair and a red ribbon in her hair, turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, not shadowed, but black. Empty voids where eyes should have been. She smiled, and then they all turned. 5 pairs of black eyes locked onto mine. 5 identical smiles spreading across their faces. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind howling against the windows. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching as the children began to move. Not walking, gliding. Their feet didn't touch the ground as they drifted toward the library, their hands still linked, their mouths still curved in those terrible smiles. They reached the door. I could see them through the glass, their faces pressed against it, their breath not fogging the windows because they weren't breathing. The little girl with the red ribbon raised her free hand and knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the empty library like gunshots. "Let us in," she said. Her voice was sweet, innocent, the voice of a child asking for help. "We're so cold. Please let us in." I shook my head, unable to speak, my throat tight with terror. The other children joined in, their voices overlapping, creating a chorus that made my skin crawl. Let us in, let us in, let us in. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, listening to their pleas. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp, and all I could focus on was those black eyes staring at me, those small hands pressed against the glass. Then I remembered something, an old story my grandmother had told me when I was young, about children who died in a blizzard and came back looking for warmth. She'd warned me never to let them in, no matter how much they begged, because they didn't want warmth. They wanted company. They wanted someone to join them in the cold. "No," I whispered, then louder, "No, you can't come in." The smiles vanished, their faces twisted into expressions of rage, their mouths opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, frost-covered teeth. They began to bang on the door, their small fists pounding with a force that shook the entire building. Books fell from shelves, windows rattled, the lights flickered. I ran to the back of the library, fumbling for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. I had to get out. I had to get to the back door, to my car, to anywhere but here. Behind me, I could hear the glass cracking, the sound of something giving way. I burst through the back door into the alley, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. My car was parked 20 feet away, covered in snow, and I ran for it, slipping and sliding on the ice. I could hear them behind me, their voices high and shrill, no longer singing, but screaming. Words I couldn't understand, sounds that made my ears ring and my head pound. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands were numb as I jammed the key into the ignition, praying it would start. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. I threw it into gear and pressed the gas, the tires spinning before finally catching traction. As I pulled out of the street, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The children were standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. They weren't chasing me anymore. They were just standing there, holding hands again, their heads tilted in that same mechanical way. Then, one by one, they began to fade, their bodies becoming transparent until nothing remained but the falling snow. I drove straight home without stopping, without looking back. When I arrived, I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in the living room with all the lights on until my husband came home. I told him I'd gotten sick and left early, and he didn't question it. The next morning, when I went to return the library keys to Mrs. Henderson, I learned something that froze my blood. She told me that in 1891, during a Christmas party, 5 children trapped inside the library had burned to death. They rebuilt the library in the exact same place. But every winter, strange and unsettling things happened. Books moving on their own, cold spots, that never went away. And sometimes, late at night, people reported hearing children singing. I quit that job the very same day. I never set foot in that library again. And even now, when I hear children singing Christmas carols, I'm certain I can see their shadows. Because if I can't see them, I know they aren't really children. They're something that was never meant to come back. But you're probably wondering, did anyone else ever see them? Did anyone else experience what I did? The answer is yes. 3 years after I left, a janitor working late claimed he saw the same children. He let them in. They found him the next morning, frozen solid in the middle of the library floor, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was hypothermia, even though the heat had been running all night and the temperature inside never dropped below 70 degrees. Some doors should never be opened. Some invitations should never be accepted. And some children should never be let inside, no matter how cold they say they are. Because once you let them in, you become part of their circle. And circles, my dear, have no end. If you're brave enough to continue, comment "I'm still here" and subscribe for the next tale. So you've made it this far. Most people would have stopped listening by now, convinced themselves these are just the stories of a senile old woman with too much time on her hands. But you're still here, leaning forward in your seat, and I can see it in your eyes. You believe me. Or at least, part of you wants to. That's good. Because this is the one that still wakes me up at night. This is the one that made me understand that some things in this world are far worse than ghosts or spirits or whatever you want to call them. Some things are alive, ancient, hungry. Let me This happened in the winter of 1995. I was 51 at the time, and I thought I had seen everything the world could possibly throw at me. My husband had passed away 2 years earlier, and my children had moved to different states with their own families. For the first time in decades, I was alone, and I'll admit it, the loneliness was eating at me. So when my friend Margaret suggested we spend a week at her family's old hunting cabin in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, I agreed immediately. The cabin was remote, about 5 kilometers from the nearest road, and could only be reached by snowmobile or cross-country skis. Margaret promised it would be an adventure, a chance to unplug and reconnect with nature. She'd been going there since childhood and assured me it was safe, cozy, and peaceful. What she didn't tell me was that her family hadn't used the cabin in more than 5 years, and that the last person who stayed there had left in the middle of the night and never returned. We arrived on a Monday afternoon in mid-January. The cabin was small, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room dominated by a large stone fireplace. The windows were frosted over, and the air inside was freezing. Our breath showed in thick clouds. But Margaret, having spent so many childhood winters there, came prepared. She brought firewood, gas lanterns, and enough food for us to last the week. Within an hour, we had a crackling fire going, and the cabin began to warm. The first night was perfect. We cooked a simple dinner, drank wine, and talked for hours about our lives, our regrets, our hopes for the future. After so much time alone, the easy conversation was comforting. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the windows. But inside, we were warm and safe, or so I thought. Things only began to go wrong on the second night. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a scratching sound. At first, it was faint, so faint I thought I was dreaming. But as I lay in the darkness listening, the sound grew louder. It was coming from the wall beside my bed. A slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across wood. My heart started pounding as I sat up. In a shaky whisper, I called, "Margaret." But there was no reply. Her room was on the opposite side of the cabin, and the walls were thick. She wouldn't hear me unless I shouted. The scratching continued, moving slowly down the wall, then across to the corner of the room. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the far corner where the sound was coming from. There was nothing there, just bare wood and shadows. But the scratching didn't stop. It moved again, this time to the ceiling directly above my head. I pointed the flashlight up, my hands shaking so badly the beam wavered. Still nothing. Just wooden beams and cobwebs. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell back asleep, convincing myself it had been an animal in the walls, a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten inside to escape the cold. The next morning, I mentioned it to Margaret over breakfast. She laughed it off, said the cabin was old and probably had mice or bats. She'd heard strange noises, too, over the years, she said, and it was nothing to worry about. But I could see something in her eyes, a flicker of unease that she was trying to hide. She knew something she wasn't telling me. That night, I made sure to go to bed early, hoping that if I fell asleep quickly enough, I wouldn't hear the scratching again. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, to the creaking of the cabin settling, to every small sound that seemed amplified in the silence. And then, right on schedule at 2 a.m., it started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. And it wasn't just scratching. There was a tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking on the inside of the wall. Tap, tap, tap. pause, tap, 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 pause, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. I grabbed the flashlight and got out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor with a shock that made me gasp. I had to know what was making that sound. I had to see for myself that it was just an animal, just something explainable and mundane. I followed the sound to the far wall of the bedroom, pressing my ear against the wood. The tapping was so close now, I could feel the vibrations through the wall. And then I heard something else, a voice, low and raspy, barely audible, but unmistakably human. "Let me out," it whispered. "Please, let me out." I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It hit the floor with a loud clatter, the beams spinning wildly across the walls. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I felt like I was going to be sick. There was someone inside the wall, someone trapped, someone who needed help. Or was there? I picked up the flashlight with trembling hands and shone it at the wall. It looked solid, undisturbed. There was no gap, no crack, no way for anyone to be inside. But the voice came again, stronger this time, more desperate. "Let me out! It's so cold in here. Please!" I backed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the wall. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the voice was so clear, so close, it felt like whoever was speaking was standing right next to me. I ran to Margaret's room and pounded on the door. "Margaret, wake up! There's something in my wall!" The door opened, and Margaret stood there in her nightgown, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "There's someone in the wall," I said, grabbing her arm. "I heard them. They're asking to be let out." Margaret's face went pale. For a moment, she just stared at me, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I was feeling. Then she shook her head. "You can't listen to it," she said quietly. "Whatever you do, don't listen." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "If someone's trapped in there—" "There's nothing in the wall," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but shaking. "Nothing alive anyway." She pulled me into the main room and sat me down by the fire, which had burned down to embers. She added more wood, stoking it until the flames roared back to life. And then she sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should have told you before we came," she said. "But I thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe it wouldn't happen." "What wouldn't happen?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Margaret took a deep breath. "When I was 12, my uncle stayed here alone for a weekend. He was a hunter, spent half his life in these woods, wasn't afraid of anything. But when he came back, he was different. Quiet, haunted. He told my father that he'd heard voices in the walls, that something had tried to get him to open them up. He said it sounded like my grandmother, who died the year before. It knew her voice. It knew exactly what to say to make him want to help. "What happened?" I whispered. "He didn't listen," Margaret said. "He packed up and left. But the next person who stayed here, a friend of the family, she did. She heard her daughter calling for help, and she tore open the wall. They found her 3 days later, frozen to death outside the cabin. She'd walked out into the snow in the middle of the night and just kept walking." I felt my blood turn to ice. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was just a story," Margaret said, tears welling in her eyes. "My family stopped using the cabin after that, but I thought maybe it was all in their heads. Maybe it was just the isolation, the cold, playing tricks on them. I thought we'd be fine." But we weren't fine. That night, neither of us slept. We sat by the fire, talking, trying to distract ourselves. But we could both hear it, the scratching, the tapping, and the voices, multiple voices now, coming from different parts of the cabin. Some sounded like children, others like old men. One sounded like Margaret's mother, who'd been dead for 10 years. They all said the same thing. "Let me out, please. I'm so cold." By the time dawn broke, we'd made our decision. We were leaving. We packed our bags as quickly as we could, not bothering to clean up, not bothering to secure the cabin. We just wanted to get out. But when we opened the front door, we stopped dead in our tracks. The snow outside was covered in tracks, hundreds of them, small ones, large ones, all circling the cabin, spiraling inward toward the door. And they were fresh, made sometime during the night while we'd been inside. But there were no tracks leading away. Whatever had made them was still here. Margaret grabbed my hand, and we ran. We didn't bother with the snowmobiles, didn't bother with the trail. We just ran through the woods, our boots sinking into the deep snow, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, we could hear it, not footsteps, but something worse. A dragging sound, heavy and labored, like something massive pulling itself through the snow. And the voices. Oh, God, the voices! They followed us, echoing through the trees, begging us to come back, to help them, to let them in. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where a passing truck saw us and picked us up. The driver, a local man who'd lived in the area his whole life, took one look at our faces and didn't ask questions. He just drove us to the nearest town and dropped us off at a motel. That night, Margaret called her brother and told him to sell the cabin. She didn't care what he got for it. She just wanted it gone. But when he went up there a week later to assess the property, he found something that made him call the police. The walls of the cabin had been torn open from the inside, every single one, and scratched into the exposed wood, over and over in different handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for letting us out." The cabin burned down a month later. They said it was an electrical fire, but there was no electricity in that cabin. There never had been. Margaret and I never spoke about what happened. We drifted apart over the years, the memory too painful to revisit. But I still think about it. I think about those voices, about the thing that followed us through the woods, about the tracks in the snow that had no beginning and no end. And I wonder sometimes if we really got away, because ever since that night, I've heard scratching in the walls of every house I've lived in. Faint, barely there, but undeniable. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear a voice whisper my name. It sounds just like my husband, but I know better than to answer. I know better than to look, because if I do, if I acknowledge it, I'll become like those people in the cabin walls, trapped, frozen, calling out for someone to let me out, knowing that no one ever will. So I ignore it. I turn on the TV. I read a book. I do anything to drown it out. And I pray that whatever is in those walls, whatever followed us out of that cabin, will eventually get bored and move on to someone else. But deep down, I know it won't. Because once it has your voice, once it knows your name, it never really lets go. And that, my dear, is why I sleep with the lights on, why I never stay anywhere too quiet, why I surround myself with noise and people and life. Because silence is dangerous. Silence lets you hear things you shouldn't, things that should have stayed buried in the snow, in the woods, in the walls of that God-forsaken cabin. So take my advice. If you ever hear something scratching in your walls, if you ever hear a voice calling for help, don't investigate. Don't try to save them. Just leave. Get out. Run as far and as fast as you can. Because whatever is behind those walls, it doesn't want help. It wants you. And once it has you, you'll spend the rest of eternity scratching at the walls, calling out to the next person, foolish enough to listen. You'll want to hear the last tale before the snow gets any heavier. I know what you're thinking. 3 stories should have been enough. But there's one more I need to tell you. One that happened just last winter. Yes, even at my age, even after everything I've seen, the cold still finds ways to remind me that I'm not safe, that none of us are. Last December, I was living in a small assisted living community in Vermont. A quiet, lovely place with mountain views and a garden where the residents could sit during the warm months. Most of the people there were like me, old, alone, and waiting out the rest of our lives. But we manage. We play cards. We watch television. We complain about the meals. Not the most exciting life, but life nonetheless. My room overlooks the garden, and I spend most of my days sitting by the window, watching the world go by. In winter, the garden becomes a white canvas, and the bare trees look like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It has a melancholy beauty, and I've always found it peaceful until the snowman appeared. It was Tuesday morning, the day after a heavy snowfall. I was in my usual spot, drinking tea and watching the staff shovel the walkways, when I noticed it. Someone had built a snowman in the middle of the garden, right beside the old stone fountain that sits unused in the winter. It was a lovely snowman, about 6 feet tall, with a carrot nose and coal eyes. It wore an old top hat and a red scarf, and its stick arms looked as if it was waving. The snowman reminded me of childhood winters long gone. I thought it was adorable. I assumed some of the staff had made it to cheer up the residents. I even smiled at the silly gesture. But then I noticed something strange. The snowman's coal eyes weren't looking outward. They were pointed directly at my window, directly at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a snowman, an inanimate pile of snow shaped by human hands. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that those dead black eyes were following my every move. That night, I closed the curtains before bed, something I never do. I like to fall asleep watching the moonlight on the snow, but that night, I didn't want to see the garden. I didn't want to see the snowman, but I could feel it. Even with the curtains drawn, even in the darkness, I knew it was still there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I opened the curtains with trembling hands, half expecting the snowman to be gone, melted or knocked down by the wind. But it was still there, and it had moved, not much, just a few feet closer to the building, but enough that I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone had moved it, or it had moved itself. I called the front desk and asked if anyone had been in the garden that morning. The woman who answered, a sweet girl named Amy, said no. The snow was too deep, she explained, and they wouldn't clear the garden paths until spring. No one had been out there, but the snowman had moved. I knew it had. I spent the day watching it, barely eating, barely moving from my chair. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, I saw it happen. The snowman turned its head. Slowly, deliberately, its coal eyes shifting until they were once again locked on my window. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound tore from my throat before I could stop it, and within seconds, a nurse was in my room asking what was wrong. I pointed at the window, at the garden, at the snowman, but she just smiled and patted my hand. "It's just your imagination, dear," she said. "You've been cooped up too long. Why don't I bring you some warm milk?" But it wasn't my imagination. I knew what I'd seen. And that night, when everyone else was asleep and the hallways were dark and quiet, I heard it. A soft tapping on my window. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I heard nothing. But I had to know. I had to see. I got up and walked to the window, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out. I pulled back the curtain just an inch, just enough to peek outside, and my heart stopped. The snowman was standing directly outside my window, its face pressed against the glass. The coal eyes were gone, replaced by two gaping black holes that seemed to stare into my soul. Its twig arms were raised, scraping against the window with that horrible tapping sound. And its mouth, which had been a simple curved line of pebbles, was now open, wide open. A dark, frozen void filled with jagged ice teeth. It wanted in. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the floor. Pain shot through my hip, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was that thing outside my window. That abomination wearing the shape of a childhood toy, trying to claw its way inside. I crawled to the door and pulled myself up, fumbling for the handle. I had to get out. I had to get help. But when I yanked the door open, I froze. Standing in the hallway, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting, was a figure, tall, thin, made of snow. It was inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away until I hit the wall. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I could feel tears streaming down my face. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the shadow under my door moved, shifting as the thing outside pressed against the wood. And then I heard it speak. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice like wind through dead trees. "I've been waiting so long. Let me in." I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the wall, watching that shadow move back and forth under the door. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The shadow retreated, and the hallway fell silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed with the lights on, staring at the door, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. The next morning, I demanded to be moved to a different room. The staff thought I'd had a bad dream, a side effect of new medication, but they humored me. By noon, I was in a room on the opposite side of the building, with a view of the parking lot instead of the garden. But before I left, I looked out the window one last time. The snowman was back in its original spot, wearing its top hat and red scarf, its stick arms positioned in a friendly wave, and carved into the snow at its base, in letters large enough for me to read from 3 floors up, was a message: "Soon." They tore it down that afternoon after I told them about the message. They said it was vandals, teenagers playing a prank. And maybe they were right. But I know better. I know what I saw, what I felt. And I know that when winter comes again this year, it will come back. It will find me. because whatever that thing was, whatever dark piece of winter given form and hunger, it marked me. It chose me. So I'm telling you this story now, while I still can, while I'm still me, because if you ever see a snowman that seems to be watching you, if you ever wake up to tapping on your window in the dead of winter, don't look. Don't investigate. Just run. Run and don't look back. Because winter isn't just cold and snow and ice. It's something older, something patient, something that builds itself out of the very thing we find most innocent, most harmless. And when it finally comes for you, it will smile with its jagged ice teeth and whisper in its wind voice, "I've been waiting," just like it's waiting for me. And if you want to hear the final story before winter finds me again, make sure you like and subscribe. I'll be waiting too.